Alrighty. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session. My name is Dr. Jared Dmello. I'm an assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology at Sam Houston State University, and I'm also a research associate at the Rutgers Center on Public Security. I'm so excited to be here today to talk about some of the initial findings from my new research study that was funded by the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center. Just a note that this project was funded by the NJGVRC. However, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of the center. So to get us started, when we're thinking about gangs and sort of gang violence, I think it's really helpful to just sort of come at the definition from a sort of collective or joint space. And in New Jersey, the gangs definition or the gang statute is actually under Title 2C 33-29. And ultimately in New Jersey, it categorizes a criminal street gang as 3 or more persons that are associated with one another. And ultimately, 2 out of 7 of those criteria that are listed here have to be met. In terms of the broader sort of gang characterizations, this is actually on the more sort of advanced end. And it's because it provides options to law enforcement. And this is a good thing, but also a little bit problematic because sometimes there could be correlations, right? Things that are not necessarily like indicative of gang activity that could have someone resulting and being caught up with gang violence in the state. However, that being said, the definition of gangs and gang violence in New Jersey is far more specific than a lot of the other states in the United States, which makes it very interesting to look at. From an academic perspective, gang violence in the state has been looked at in quite a few contexts. So McLoin, who's a graduate from Rutgers, actually really sort of has led the effort with gang activity from a scholarly perspective. And McGloin and Pizarro's work is really looking at social networks of gang violence. So they're trying to understand how the connectivity of gangs actually impacts the broader conflict structures. I think this is very interesting because it sort of inspired another one of my projects, which is looking at 50 years of gang conflicts in New Jersey and sort of mapping those out. And I'll come back to that project in just a second. But ultimately, what we see in the state of New Jersey is that from 1996 onward, there's been a lot of legislation that either targets new aspects of gang activity or that it sort of modernizes or refreshes some of those previous statutes. And I think what's really important is there's a lot of legislative time, a lot of resources, and a lot of money that's gone into the gang problem in New Jersey. But we still tend to have this sort of social problem, right? The social epidemic, if you will, of gang activity throughout the state. And so ultimately, this sparked my interest because I was curious in understanding why. Like, why is it that despite all of this legislation, despite of all the resources that the state has given to gangs, or rather gang enforcement, that we still have this gang problem in New Jersey? And so ultimately, the current project really is sort of a leap-off point from my NIJ-funded research looking at the gang networks. And in that project, we're looking at the network connections, right? How do offenders connect with victims, to law enforcement, to witnesses? But it's pretty much at the individual level. But I was curious, I said, with all of this legislation, with all of these sort of changes and efforts and initiatives that law enforcement's put into place, we're still seeing high levels of violence. So I wanted to understand more about the individuals involved with this process. And so ultimately, given all of these efforts, the current project is trying to understand what are the different typologies of current gang members, what are their motivators, what are their drivers, and ultimately, the goal is to try to understand how we can connect those motivators to future efforts to sort of target this anti-gun and anti-gang violence efforts. So the data for this project is actually coming from a sample of court cases from LexisNexis within the state of New Jersey. It's capped with the phrase gang from 1970 to 2019. There were about 1,500 court cases within the total sort of initial poll. Of those, about 500 were actually gang-related crimes. A lot of the ones that got kicked out had things like a gang of workers or things like that, where there was the word gang in there, but it was actually pertaining to a criminal street gang. And of those 500, there are 182 that are specifically involving firearms within the commission of violence. And that's really sort of the sample we're focusing on. Acknowledging that it was 182 in the full sample, really we wanted to use this pilot grant to get a random sample of 50 different individuals to understand what is it that we're looking at, what are some of those preliminary trends, and then ultimately based off those findings, we're going to sort of cater our approach and then move forward to get future funding to fill out the rest of the 132. I have a really amazing research team. My two RAs couldn't be here today, but a huge shout out to Caitlin and Shalom. They actually have done a wonderful job. So we were aiming for 50 throughout the funding period, and we're currently coded at about 60. Exactly 60, and we're hoping to be to raise those numbers a little bit more before our funding ends here in a little bit. So we are very excited for that opportunity. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is when we understand these typologies, we wanted to actually do a very in-depth code book. And so this project is really building off of a coding initiative that's been done in the terrorism space. So John Horgan and Neil Shortland have really done a lot of work with this, looking at the global jihad movement, ISIS offenders in the United States, and then my lab has also done some work using the similar framework for the Capitol insurrection. Ultimately, though, what my codebook is adding to the work of Horgan and Shortland is we added in the cyber components to understand how cyber is also impacting some of these typological decisions. So this codebook is massive. There's 200 different variables included within it, things from family dynamics to education, prior criminality, their motivations and commitments, charging and sentencing decisions, and then, the last bullet point is cut off here, but criminal engagement. So we're looking at a ton of different factors, whether mental health was involved, whether there was cooperation with law enforcement, you name it. So just a bit of context. So the map on the right is an official image from the New Jersey State Police Street Gang Survey. And so that's actually sort of where they show the distribution of gang activity in the state. And on the left is the cases from our study. And those cases are actually showing that the gang activity is far more dispersed if we take into account more recent activity, which is something that should be alarming from a law enforcement perspective. In terms of our analytic strategy, I can't emphasize this enough. This is a very exploratory study. And so today I'm only talking about descriptive data. And the reason for that is we're still coding. So we didn't want to do any of those more complex analyses because we didn't want to have any sort of false associations until we've had a chance to go deeper into the data. The coding will be wrapping up here in May, and then we'll be doing those more complex analyses over the summer. So stay tuned for additional information. In terms of sort of these descriptive findings, though, so far for the 60 individuals that we've coded, the age range is dramatically varying from 15 years all the way up to 48. Because we're interested in sort of this network component, it's important to note that the vast majority, so 93% of all of these people coded are directly showing connections within their networks to violence as well. So it's not strangers to violence coming in, right? So the vast majority are tied to these networks already. As we would expect, the majority are male, and we have just over 50% are US citizens. In terms of affiliations, this got very messy when I copied it over. I apologize. But the vast majority of the gangs are actually a part of the Bloods. But we see all sorts of gangs in there. We see neo-nationalist groups, we see MS-13, we see the Crips, and Latin Kings as well. In terms of convictions, this is where I think it's really interesting because we actually sampled for individuals who were engaged in firearm-related offenses, but not all of those individuals actually were convicted on firearm-related charges. So about 45 of the 60 that we coded were actually convicted for firearm charges, and about the same threshold for murder or homicide. In terms of the motivations and the commitments, this is where I think is actually really interesting from the preliminary findings. The vast majority of individuals coded perceive themselves as a victim of some sort of injustice. And collectively, there's perceived grievances of either a collective group that they belong to. Most of them associate with some sort of racial connection. But also at high level, we'll say some sort of ties of individuals. And there was a good portion that actually identified that they had grievances both at the collective and individual levels as well. So those aren't mutually exclusive. Most of these gang members did say that they're willing to die for the cause of promoting their own values. And something that I found particularly interesting is more individuals were actually driven by economic and financial gains than they were by criminal incentives. Which is something that we see a little bit different from gang populations in other states, which I thought was something worth sort of exploring in more details. So again, we're in the very early phases of this research. We haven't done any of the statistical analyses yet because we're trying to get as big of a sample as possible. But to acknowledge some limitations from within the study, there is a possibility of coding or coder bias. We did a lot of reliability testing. And we continue to do random reliability testing to sort of minimize this, but it is a possibility that it is there. But I think a huge drawback is LexisNexis only gives access to appeals data. And because of that, we know that we're only seeing a very small portion of the gang charges that are actually going through the court system within the state of New Jersey. This is something I ran into with my NIJ project as well. And so I've actually been working with a member of the New Jersey State Commission on Violence to see if we can establish some collaborations with state level law enforcement initiatives and the courts to help get access to some of those more primary data sources that are beyond just the appeals to try and build out a more robust sample. And so we're actually working on a proposal right now with those relevant stakeholders to see if we can actually get approval from them and then to actually seek out additional funding to do that research. Despite these limitations, though, there's some really interesting findings and there's some promise for the future analyses. Again, I think some of the interesting takeaways here are that most gang members themselves are perceiving themselves as victims. So I think this really calls into question sort of victim services and sort of the need to sort of the need to actually like better fund and better staff and resource victim service units as a way of countering gang violence in the future, but also addressing the grievances that are being addressed or that are being raised by these gang members. In terms of our next steps, we are going to finalize coding and analyze this full data set. As I mentioned, we're starting work to engage the stakeholder communities, not just for future research, but also to work with them on policy initiatives to target some of these motivators that we're seeing. And ultimately, what I'd like to do is I'd like to merge this data set with the NIJ funded network data to understand how these typological decisions are actually impacting the longitudinal network evolution of the gang conflict in the state of New Jersey. So thank you so much. I am excited to sort of engage with you in conversation and any questions that you may have. I know that Dr. Plunkett has put a comment in the chat, and I'm not sure if y'all can see the comments, so I'll just go ahead and read it. But he said, your maps answer a question I was going to pose. Do the suburban municipalities still deny they have gangs active in the community? And Frank, that's actually a really great point. In some levels, yes. In some levels, no. So I was giving a presentation for the NIJ version of this project at ASC last year. And someone actually commented to me they said, on your map, it shows that my jurisdiction has gang activity, but we don't actually have gang problems there. And so we were sort of just chatting about it, and I actually pulled up the data set and was able to pull some court records that are explicit to that principality. And so they were just shocked. They had no idea that there were gang activity within that jurisdiction. So I don't know. I think that some do, but I think that the extent of sort of this diffusion of the gang violence has resulted in more people acknowledging that even if it's not like the most salient threat or the most like prominent driver of crime, that there is a gang presence in most of these populations and communities. Frank also said, is there a way to search publicly accessible Superior Court case records? We've looked into a few different mechanisms. There is a data set called Unicourt that seems promising. I actually have a meeting with them in a couple of weeks after the semester ends to talk about what sort of data they have. That one is not free. You do have to pay for access, and I'm not sure if it's like a subscription to use their data sets or if you have to pay per record. But that may be an option for future, so like sort of future work and future endeavors with that. But I'm not 100% sure. My understanding from previous studies was that there was some kind of gang activity in each of New Jersey's 21 counties. Yeah, and I mean, I'm seeing that for the NIJ project too. And even with the sample of just the appeals, we're seeing it throughout New Jersey as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Angela Cynthia said, thank you very much, Dr. Dmello. Great presentation. If anyone has any more questions, please send them over to us. Yes, and if you think of any other questions later, I know like when we're seeing these talks all day, sometimes we get overwhelmed with information. If something pops up later, please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to, answer more questions via email, or if you wanted to pop on a Zoom chat, we could have that conversation as well. Frank said, I read a story in the Inquirer recently, and they were able to text search PA court dockets. That would actually be a really interesting thing to do within the New Jersey context. Thanks, Frank. I'm going to look into that. Anyone else? Good seeing you too, Frank. Thanks, everyone. And again, I just want to give a huge shout out to the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center for funding this project. Thanks, y'all.